Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I am Shailagh Murray, the Executive Vice President for Public Affairs here at Columbia. I'm delighted to welcome you to this town hall meeting on Europe. We are extremely honored to have with us the first Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Mr. Timmermans joined the EU Commission 5 years ago. Prior to that, he held a number of high-level diplomatic and political positions, always working in European affairs, as a diplomat, as an advisor to EU and OSCE commissioners, as a member of the Dutch Parliament, as the Dutch Minister for Foreign Affairs, and as the Dutch Foreign Minister. At the EU Commission, Vice President Timmermans has been in charge for the last 5 years of better regulation, interinstitutional relations, the rule of law, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. That's a fancy way of saying he's been in the middle of everything. Among other responsibilities, in his free time, he has led the Commission's efforts to manage migration, defend the judiciary, and fight terrorism. Frans Timmermans' new task is as monumental as any he has ever taken on. He has been designated to become Executive Vice President for the European Green Deal in the new Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen. The goal of the European Green Deal is for Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent. The mission assigned by President-elect von der Leyen is to Vice President Timmermans will be, among other tasks, to increase Europe's emission reduction target and lead international negotiations to also increase the level of ambition of other major emitters. It will obviously be a crucial mission, both for Europe and for global efforts to address climate change. And it's a great privilege for us to have an opportunity today to discuss these perspectives with Frans Timmermans and also reflect on the experience of the past 5 years. We had the honor of hosting Vice President Timmermans at Columbia last year, and also on other occasions before. And it has always been for us a particular pleasure to engage in an open discussion with him. So, Mr. Vice President, welcome back, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
We've proposed to organize today's event in the format of a town hall meeting, and we will invite questions from our participants on the challenges facing Europe and the transatlantic relationship. This fall will mark the start of a new EU Commission. It will also coincide with the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the divide between the East and West of Europe. This is an appropriate moment to reflect on what has been achieved and as well on what lies ahead. Professor Pierre Vimont will guide us in this conversation. Pierre Vimont is a visiting professor at the European Institute and at the School of International and Public Affairs, where he teaches a course on the diplomacy of the European Union. He is also a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. Prior to coming to Columbia, Professor Vimont was the first Executive Secretary General of the European External Action Service, the new diplomatic service of the European Union. He also served as the French ambassador to the United States, as well as ambassador to the European Union. Ambassador Vimont will moderate the discussion and the questions and answers session with the audience. I would like to thank the organizers and co-sponsors of this event, which is made possible thanks to the support of the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, the School of International and Public Affairs, the European Institute, the Center for Global Economic Governance, the International Finance and Economic Policy Concentration, the Initiative on Central Banking and Financial Policy, the Columbia European Union Student Association, and the Columbia European Society. We will be recording a video of this event to post on our co-sponsors' sites. I will now give the floor to Pierre Vimont, who will introduce the discussion. But before that, please join me in welcoming Vice President Timmermans.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shailagh. Vice President, thank you for being here. This is becoming a bit of a tradition, I think, now to have you during the UNGA week here in New York. So when you're here, we know that we're going to have a sort of state of the European Union at the beginning of the political year, and we're very happy to have you here. I'm here mostly to launch the conversation, and then I hope that many questions will come up from the audience here. So for me, I think maybe the question I would ask you is, you were in the outgoing commission, one of the main figures, in fact, the first vice president. You got more or less all the hot potatoes during that tenure, migration, rule of law, so on and so forth. You're going to be once again one of the main figures in the next European Commission. And when we look at some of the priorities that have been listed by the new president, the incoming president of the European Union, we got the sense of some sort of continuity there. But at the same time, we have also the perception that things are not exactly the same as they were 5 years ago when you came in. So could I ask for your own assessment? Are we facing the same challenges? Is there suddenly a sense of urgency that wasn't there 5 years ago? How do you see the road ahead, in other words?
Well, first of all, let me pay tribute to Colombia. Because when the rest of US academia gave up on Europe about 15 to 10 years ago, and you couldn't find many academics in the US who actually had an interest in our old continent, Colombia never gave up. And that's why I like to come back every year and talk to you about what's happening on the other side of the pond. And then to go to your question, Pierre, let me take you back just a number of months to the electoral campaign for the European elections. I ran on behalf of the European Social Democrats and Socialists as their lead candidate, and I decided to go into the election on the basis of what I thought were the big challenges for Europe, which in my view were climate change, social justice, international relations, and a number of other issues really linked to the transformative nature of the time we live in. So are we going to be able to come out of this fourth industrial revolution leaving no one behind? That's the fundamental question at a time where, for the first time in arguably 100 years, parents have the feeling that their children might not be as well off as they were. So this is what I tried in the electoral campaign. My opponents on the Conservative side went for migration, for security, all the issues that had been very dominant 5 years before. And no, not to just blow my own horn, but frankly speaking, the electoral campaign was about climate change, about social justice, about everything we need to do to prepare our societies in this new era. And this, I think, is what you see reflected in the program of the next Commission, because whatever you can say about the Conservatives, they are pragmatic, and they saw they didn't make the impact they wanted to make because they didn't get the right issues from the start. So now they've embraced this, and Ursula von der Leyen has done this with great talent. So this Commission is very much about the Green Deal. It's about how we adapt to the digital world, and this is about how we redirect finance to make sure that in Europe nobody is left behind. And I believe this is a new agenda. Yes, there is continuity, because we can't deliver on this agenda if we don't also give a more fundamental, more structured answer to the migration challenge, if we don't complete the digital single market, if we don't complete the energy union. So there are elements of continuity, but the electoral campaign and the election result showed clearly that there's a new sense of urgency on especially climate change across European society. My party was predicted to come out with less than 100 mandates in the European Parliament 3 months before the elections. We came out with more than 150 members of the European Parliament, second party in the European Parliament. In my own country, my party was on the 7th or 8th place in the national political environment. We came out first after the election because of this agenda, which is something also the Dutch people attach great importance to. So things are changing, but we have to deliver very quickly on these changes. And let me end on that. On my specific portfolio, if we want to be a climate neutral continent by 2050, we have to have reduced our emissions with 55% at least by 2030. To do that, we will start to have to implement legislation very soon. To do that, we will have to come out with our plans within the first 100 days after the 1st of November when this Commission takes up office, which means that if we get that wrong, we will not get the legislation in place in the next 5 years, and then we will never make the target of being climate neutral in 2050. So the sense of urgency is very, very high, and I hope we can be able to deliver on that, but that's where you come in, because the only way we can deliver on that is if public pressure is high enough. Thanks.
Would you say that another reason for this sense of urgency is the rise, as it has been quite often assessed, the rise of the United States being there as a great power on one side and the rise of China on the other side, and therefore Europe, it's the whole challenge of how do they promote, defend and protect their own economic and social model. There is this sense also of urgency there that we have been waiting for too long and that time is running out for us.
Well, of course, we've basked for, you mentioned, well, in the introduction was mentioned also the end of the Cold War. I was born in the year that the Berlin Wall was built. Our son Mark was born in the year that the wall came down. And so for him, the Cold War is something he knows from history books, not from personal experience. And this is something, Pierre, you and I have a different experience with. And this is quite a change in the mentality of Europeans. And in all this time my son has lived, 30 years now, American dominance was benign and acceptable and good, and it gave us Europeans a chance to not be too much involved in something we don't like, which is geopolitics. Now that ship has sailed because there's a new kid on the block who's very powerful and who, for the first time, Europe has now also said might be a systemic challenger. You know, I would, if you're interested in these things, look at the conclusions of the European Council a couple of months ago on China. For the first time, Europe is not just looking at China as the place where they buy European cars. It's looking at China as a place that might be a systemic challenger of our way of life. And this is a completely new attitude. So we need to come to terms with the fact that the American dominance, America will remain an extremely important global player. But the fact that the monopolar world is not happening. And we have a vested interest as Europeans to prevent a bipolar world from happening and create a multipolar world. Because if the competition between the United States and China becomes fundamentally systemic, that we create, you know, an American internet and a Chinese internet, American AI, Chinese AI, etc., Europe will not be able to find its place in that. So Europe will be torn between the necessity to create stability on this huge Eurasian continent, on the one hand, and still maintain its fundamental relationship based on values with the United States. So we have a vested interest in preventing that from happening, which means that Europe will have to take responsibility more than we ever did before in global issues. And Europe is no longer able to say, well, you know, leave us alone, we'll trade, we'll do everything, but geopolitics is something for somebody else. We need to take that responsibility, and we have difficulty in doing that. And sadly, we're also losing one of our most powerful in terms of geopolitics member states in the process, which I think is a great loss to the European Union as well.
Last question, and then I will leave it to you. The town hall meeting, so be prepared to ask all the questions you want to raise. Vice President, you were meeting yesterday Mr. Gutierrez, and I read very carefully the communique that came out of that meeting where you both sides talked about the need to protect and promote the multilateral system. Where are the assets and the leverage for the European Union to play that role? We know Europe has been repeating time and again that it is in favor of a multilateral system, of the present multilateral system, updated if need be, modernized, revised if necessary. But how do you make this happen when you're facing precisely the current American presidency, which doesn't seem to be so happy about multilateralism, and maybe China, who's trying to set up a different kind of multilateralism? How can Europe compete with that?
Well, I think by being pragmatic in terms of looking for where the common interests lie. And I believe, you know, especially on a day like today, where we have our climate summit, I believe that globally, the feeling is shared that if we don't take care of the climate crisis, we will all suffer. Now, I know this is not a view entirely shared by the White House, but it is a view broadly shared in American society, and especially at levels of the cities and states and academia and the business community. So it is also shared in China. They might not be as vocal about that, but they know that they have a huge problem with, you know, the air quality in their cities. They have a huge problem with having sustainable water provision. They have a huge problem also in social sustainability in the long run. So I believe if you look at the climate crisis, it's an existential crisis. It will ask of us transformational changes, but it's also an opportunity to, you know, so reboot multilateralism on a different issue. And starting from there, I'm sure that this will also lead into possibilities to look into industrial cooperation, to see if we can put AI at the service of humanity as a whole and not just at the service of governments or certain governments of certain states. We will need to create new economic models in terms of our mobility, in terms of reducing our carbon emissions, etc., etc. So I see an opportunity here. Because the thing is, the one mistake we shouldn't make is to think that if we do nothing, everything will stay the same. That is the biggest trap where we risk to fall in. To, you know, the climate deniers will tell you, well, you know, it's happened all the time, let's just continue with what we're doing. We cannot afford to do that, and there is increasing public awareness that we can't afford to do that, and it will give us an opportunity to revamp the multilateral system. The one thing I would like to add about our global position. You know, when my parents were born, Europe was about 22% of the world's population, Africa 5%. 10 years from now, Europe will be 5% of the world's population and Africa more than 20%. You know, things are really changing fundamentally, and we need to adapt to that. It's not as scary as it sounds if you're willing to adapt. Africa will have a population of dominantly very young, and young people are by nature optimistic, people who really want to change for the good. And we need to be their partners. We need to give them that opportunity. We need to, if Europe doesn't do that, who else will? And I also say this because if you are a shrinking part of the world's population, which is what will happen to what we used to call the West, you cannot reduce politics to purely transactional relationships. And this is something I would like, you know, to see also America understand, that the attractiveness of America is not its military power, it's its way of life and its values. And if you are a smaller part of the world's population, your way of life, the fact that the way you live and your values appeal to the rest of the world is a much, much more powerful tool than military might. And if we neglect that tool and those values because we reduce everything to a transactional relationship, we make ourselves much smaller than we are. So I think we need to rekindle this feeling of our way of life, of our values, as something that is seen as attractive by the rest of the world. Unless, of course, we abandon our own values, then, of course, we will be seen as hypocrites. But if we stick to those values, and these values are shared, this is what I learned from the elections as well, these values are shared by a vast majority of our citizens. But let's not give up on them. Let's not reduce everything to just transactions, because then we will really lose in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vice President. Now, let's go to your questions. Who would like to start? I think there's a microphone that are circulating. Let's start with you, gentlemen.
Hi, it's an honor to have you here. I'm Yuri Kazakov. I'm a master's student at the European Institute. So one of your responsibilities was defending the rule of law, and one of the promises that the Commission President made during her election was also to defend the rule of law. So in light of that, and in general, Could you please comment on the new portfolio for defending the European way of life, which is a term that has been used to violate the rule of law in places like Hungary and Poland and Italy? Thank you.
Well, it is no secret that one of the reasons I was not nominated President of the European Commission is that especially Poland and Hungary fought hard against my nomination because I had criticized them in the last 5 years on the situation of the rule of law, freedom of the media, freedom of academia, and in Poland, the independence of the judiciary. So by them, the fact that I didn't become President of the Commission is portrayed as a big victory. But I have a message for them. This issue isn't going to go away because it is intimately linked to the way the European Union operates. And the rule of law will be a requirement for every member state and will continue to be a requirement. And if you would like to indulge me in saying why, because we are a union of big and small member states. And the only way this union can function is if even the biggest member state says, I respect the law. Because that's the protection smaller member states have against the might of the bigger member states. And that's also the only way the bigger member states can get the smaller member states to move along in the direction we want to go. So respect for the law is essential. Now, the interpretation of the law is in the hands of judges. In that sense, every national judge is a European judge. A national judge has to interpret EU law, and EU law has to be interpreted in the same way across the European Union. For that to happen, the national judge, if he or she is unsure about the application of EU law, should have unimpeded access to the European Court of Justice that can then explain what the correct interpretation of EU law is. This system assures the uniform application of EU law. Without the uniform application of EU law, the EU cannot function. Now, this system cannot tolerate that governments would instruct judges to rule according to the wishes of the government. Then the system breaks down. And this is what is threatening to happen in places like Poland, and that's why the European Commission and myself have intervened. And this will not change because somebody else will take over that responsibility. Now, on the issue of the European way of life. The European way of life is this very unique combination that even is different in the United States, has many similarities with the US, but we have this unique combination of social protection. You know, when people are old, they need to have an income that gives them the possibility to live a decent life. Access to education should be based on the merits, on talent, and not on the income of the parents. It's very European, this. And I don't hesitate to say it at Columbia. The healthcare is something that everybody should have access to, is very European, and I don't hesitate to say this in the United States. So we have many things in common, but also some manifest differences, and the combination of all these things, that's the European way of life. What we don't want to do is to say that the European way of life is a very distinct is in very distinct opposition to other cultures or other religions. And this is some politicians are willing to do that. We even have people in power in some member states who tend to propone the issue of replacement, saying we will be replaced because of immigration, they will destroy, and the European way of life is to protect us from this replacement. Now, von der Leyen, myself, the Commission, absolutely refutes that interpretation of the European way of life. We see the European way of life is also, you know, offering safe refuge to people who flee from war and persecution. If we give that up, there's no European way of life left, then we give up on our fundamental values. And so, let me be very clear, that the European way of life is not the way Mr. Orban defines it. The European way of life is the definition I've just tried to give to you.
Yes, please do. The gentleman there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I would just like to ask a small question about factionalism and conflict within Europe, or at least division within Europe, and the implications that that has for the achievement of very ambitious goals, such as the ones that you just outlined when it comes, for example, to the new European Green Deal, or other ambitions that we might have. What is your view? I mean, especially given that Europe from the outset, from the United States, from other parts of the world, often gets criticized for this internal division. What is your perspective? How successful will we be with these ambitious goals, and maybe what could we do to become more successful?
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at at our common history since the Second World War, the whole European project is about finding compromise, finding middle ground between different interests, between different power relationships, between different cultures, etc. And one of the biggest challenges of our day and age, and this is not just limited to Europe, is that we threaten to lose the culture of disagreeing well. With which I mean that we tend to only talk to people, and I hope this is not an example of that. We tend to only talk to people who already agree with us, and tend to avoid confrontation with people with whom we disagree. And this happens on different sides. Now, the European Union can never function like that because we have so many differences. So I think as part of our political culture, both in the United States and Europe, we have to take some of these, the sharpest edges of always attacking a person in his person or her person, shaming people with whom you disagree, etc. In a democracy, the art of disagreeing well is the only way forward. And I think this art is being lost sometimes in this country, and it's certainly being lost in parts of Europe. I think we need to reinvent it because finding common ground between different interests is the only way Europe can operate. And certainly now, with a Europe of 27 member states, with so many different cultural backgrounds and so many different levels of economic development, finding common ground is going to be the real art of politics. Certainly if we need to make this transformational shift into a sustainable society. Just look at the United Kingdom today, which is a country I deeply admire and love, and I've went to British schools, as you might have heard when you hear me speak. But to see that in a couple of years' time, you can create such fundamental divisions in a country that almost become unreconcilable, that almost look like almost a cultural war, and perhaps you see some of that in this country as well. It is going to make us weaker in a global environment that warrants dialogue and consensus rather than confrontation. So the irony of the populists who vilify those they disagree with, and they think that's an expression of strength. The irony is that they're making us weaker by doing that because they're making it more difficult to find compromise. And as long as we think that compromise is an expression of weakness, we will become weaker. As soon as we see that compromise is an expression of strength, we will find common ground to also dictate the agenda of the future. Europe should be more self-confident. I don't know are you familiar with GDPR, which is something that people... So the protection of your personal data. We came up with legislation, everybody told us impossible, bad, no, horrible, and it's becoming the global standard. Europe has to be more self-confident in its ability to regulate in a way that will shape our future in a more sustainable way.
Question there. Maybe I'll take the other side for a while.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a student here at SIPA. I'm from Bulgaria, and I would like to talk a little bit about the rule of law. You said that the rule of law is obviously very important, it's a prerequisite, but I would argue, maybe a little bit to challenge you, that the rule of law is not enforced in Bulgaria. And my observations are that Bulgaria has been kind of under the radar of the European Commission, and I've never seen a European politician talking about the rule of law of Bulgaria, while we have been focusing on Hungary, Poland, and I feel like maybe sometimes geopolitical and big political kind of observations and reasons are, being privileged over the very principle of the rule of law. So I would like to have your take on this.
Well, you could hardly be in a more complicated place in the world geopolitically than in Bulgaria. It's a tough neighborhood, very tough neighborhood. But I'm very sorry you didn't notice, but I've been deeply involved in the so-called CVM process with Bulgaria in the last 5 years, a cooperation verification mechanism to fight corruption and to strengthen the judiciary and to strengthen the rule of law. Much was achieved. I mean, you might not be convinced, but I think comparing to 5 years ago, much was achieved, but we're not there yet. And I don't advertise this on a daily basis in all the media, but I am in a constant dialogue with Bulgarian authorities to try and push it in the right direction. I'm not satisfied yet. We still have a long way to go. And even at some point, if CVN might be terminated, we still will have a long way to go. But to just say to all of you how complicated these things are. What is the CVN? Cooperation and verification mechanism was created because when the political pressure became very tough to admit Bulgaria and Romania into the European Union, we had to come to the conclusion that they were not ready in terms of the fight against corruption and the independence of the judiciary. They joined in 2007. 12 years later, we still haven't fixed the problem. And that is a big worry for all of us. And of course, if we then become lenient on Hungary or Poland, people in Bulgaria and Romania will say, hey, why are we always being criticized and forced to do something if you are so lenient on the others? So they also feed on each other if we're not very careful. But coming back to your question, it might not be very visible, but we, as the European Commission, we try constantly to push them further and further in fighting corruption. Some successes were attained, but we're not there yet, and we will need to work years to make the situation better. But Bulgaria comes from a long way.
Maybe I'll take the lady there. Yes, and then you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll stay in the same neighborhood. With this new multipolar world that you describe, with a new kid on the block, a less benign United States, does the EU need to revisit its relationship with Russia, at least the way it's existed in the last 5 years? And if so, how do we reconcile this with our values?
My impression is that there's someone here in the White House who also wants to revisit the relationship with Russia, but I let the United States speak for itself on this. Just so you know, I have some background there. I served as a diplomat in Moscow in the early 1990s, and I followed developments in that country since then very closely. Russia's not going anywhere. It's going to be part of our continent, and we will have to find a way forward with Russia, but a realistic way forward. I think the one issue where we can realistically establish a profitable relationship is, of course, the energy field, but only if we make sure that the EU as a whole and every single member state cannot be blackmailed or arm-twisted by Russia on the basis of their energy provision. So if you establish a long-term energy relationship with Russia based on natural gas, because that's the issue, natural gas will be part of the transformation of the European Union into a society which is no longer dependent on fossil fuels. We will need natural gas, and as you know, this is less intrusive on our natural environment than coal and petrol. But establishing a relationship on the basis of shared energy interests without having the possibility for the Russians to blackmail individual countries is I think, the way forward. But we shouldn't forget that the Russians annexed part of a neighboring country only 5 years ago. And you know, this cannot be tolerated. If the very principle that you do not change borders militarily is left aside, then Europe is in a very difficult place for a long time. So step by step, establishing a relationship which does not make us, does not put us in a position of being able to be blackmailed, is, I think, the best way forward. And energy is the best area of cooperation. And don't underestimate the things that are happening in Russian society. It is not as stable politically as we might think. An era is slowly coming to an end. It's very unpredictable what will come out of this, but you also see a civil society that, against all odds, is proving to be, in the cities at least, more vibrant than we would have anticipated. And I can assure you, these people, aspire to the European way of life. In that sense, young Russians are not that different from young Ukrainians or young other Europeans. And this gives us, in the long term, I think, a good opportunity. Just to give up on Russia is the last thing we need to do. We need to find ways forward, but no compromise on our values, no compromise on the issue that you don't touch your neighbor's territory. But the one fundamental difference in European perception of security and Russian perception of security is this. We Europeans learned that if we do not export stability, we will import instability. This is the very reasoning of European cooperation. This is the very fundamental reasoning why the European Union was enlarged. Russians have a different view. They believe weak neighbors make you stronger. And you have military might to keep them weak and to keep them out. This is a philosophical difference in the vision of geopolitics. And this clashes in Europe. And Ukraine pays a high price for that. And this is a situation we need to find compromises on. And as I said, our way of life is our most attractive appeal. And next to that, of course, the energy market. At the same time, you see that especially the more nationalistic political movements in Europe find the Putin way of seeing the world very attractive indeed. And the Russians are playing into that. So it's also almost an ideological confrontation on that front as well.
I'll take maybe one more question. One more question here, and then I'll come to the other side. I think there are questions also.
Great, thank you very much for your time. Kind of staying in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, could you comment on the accession process and your view on Europe's role in helping places like Macedonia and Albania strengthen their political systems? Also, in light of Brexit, in light of the backsliding we're talking about, what is a realistic timeline for these countries to be permitted to join, especially thinking about the Council member states voting in their favor?
That's all. And in general terms, the beauty of the European project is not that you abolish borders. The borders are still there. The border between my country and Germany is still there. The beauty of it is that you don't make borders existential any longer. Because European wars were very often fought because we thought that somebody was at our borders that wanted to change the borders with military means, so sometimes we prevented that by attacking them. I mean, that's the reasoning. So by making borders no longer a contentious issue is what created peace and stability in Europe. Now, if there's one area in Europe where this is really needed and urgently, it's the Western Balkans. We need to make borders in the Western Balkans less existential. They're still essential, but less existential, because those borders are arbitrary if you look at the composition of the population. So there is no other solution. Whatever people say in my country, there is no other solution for that part of Europe other than integrating them step by step into the Euro-Atlantic structures. I think there is no other solution. But of course your question is when? And that is going to take quite a long time. Because we have learned over the years that to digest new members is quite an effort. And they have some, we were talking about Romania and Bulgaria before, we cannot afford to take countries into the European Union that manifestly aren't ready. So we will not repeat that. So we will have to help them to get ready. So what do you do in the meantime? I think there's one country that showed incredible courage against so many odds, and that is North Macedonia. And also I think we need to praise Greece for also against public opinion in both countries, against so much resistance to make this historic deal. And we cannot go now back to North Macedonia and tell them, well done, goodbye. We have to start a process that shows also to the people that there are benefits of doing the right thing for the stability of Europe. And that is a rapprochement with the European Union. Now, I cannot honestly give you a timeline of when this leads to membership. But what I can tell you is this: because this is going to take quite a long time, we have to think about concrete steps that do not necessarily lead immediately to membership, but that do create closer links. And again, I might start sounding obsessive about this, but again, I think the energy sector and sustainable energy is essential here. We don't have a pan-Balkan grid. We don't have it. But if you create a grid where all the states, all the countries in that region depend on each other for sustainable energy supply, you create interdependencies that do create a more understanding, a more dialogue. This is also something we learned from our history. Interdependency is a good thing if you are looking forward to creating more stability. So I would say that if we work on our Green Deal, if we work on our energy union, let's also engage with the Western Balkans in a fundamental way so that they are part of this from the start. Because sooner or later you will have to expand that sustainable grid to those countries anyway. So let's start immediately. That does not have to lead to membership, but it does lead to more interconnections, literally and also politically.
So let me go back to this side. And I'll take maybe, if you agree, Vice President, 3 questions at a time so that we can put as many questions as we can. Vasileus, then yourself. The gentleman there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'm Vasilis. I'm based in Beijing for quite a while. And talking to the Chinese, when they look to the future of innovation, Industry 4, artificial intelligence, they only see America as a peer and as a country they aspire to surpass. They never mention Europe. When they do so to point at the inefficiencies of the innovation agenda in Europe, the Lisbon agenda, and the failures. So I'm wondering if there is a formative consensus in the new Commission of a need of reform and of a need of an industrial policy for Europe. And if there is such a consensus, who's going to pay for it? Are you certain that you can persuade the Germans or the Dutch to pay? Because in my understanding, these are the only 2 countries with a fiscal space to fund a significant industrial policy. Thank you.
Second question there. The third question at the back.
You mentioned the Green New Deal. You also mentioned that Europe is somewhat reluctant sometimes in geopolitics. You also mentioned law. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned is companies, corporations. They are, especially for the Green New Deal, they have to be major actors in it. There is a movement now in Germany, and you said we also have to have an agenda of laws pretty much from get-go within 90 days. There's a movement now in Germany called Lieferkettengesetz, which is the supply chain, which would require all corporations over a certain size to do both human rights and environmental assessments, not just for themselves, but for their suppliers, which is key because that gets us into Africa, gets us into Asia, etc. What is your thought on something like the Lieferkettengesetz, etc., and will it be also something that European Union can pass, which would be a way of showing the values that European Union wants?
Okay, and the third question there.
Hi, I'm Ruben. I'm also in the European Institute. My question is also with regards to the Green Deal, actually. So obviously some of the objectives that you outlined are very ambitious, right? Cutting emissions by 55% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So what are the concrete challenges on that way, and what are you concretely proposing that we can do to reach that? And the legislation that you're proposing, what does it look like, and how will that be implemented? Because it seems like a very ambitious goal to me.
You like ambitious goals, or you want us to be less ambitious? You like them. Good. Good. Let me start with a first question. Interestingly enough, especially when we talk about the climate crisis, the Chinese are very interested in Europe, much more than a couple of years ago, because they see in Europe a partner on the global scale they sadly don't see in the United States today. Obviously, they and I have that experience, they have become, I should say this kindly because we're being recorded, they have become quite centralized over the last couple of years. And of course, they don't understand or even like places that are not that centralized. But the advantage of their centralization is that they can move faster. The disadvantage of their centralization is that they can make humongous mistakes in moving fast. So turning this around, the disadvantage of being European is that you take longer. The advantage is that we make less mistakes in making these decisions. The only question is, do we have the luxury of taking so long, given the speed with which the fourth industrial revolution is engulfing the world? I think we don't. So we will need to speed up. And you cannot dissociate the Green New Deal from our need to look at AI and what this means for our society, and et cetera, et cetera. Just AI to me is still the mind-boggling thing, that we are creating machines that have the same capacity of self-awareness that in the natural world is only something humans have and primates and some sea mammals. Just imagine what the implications of that are if you start thinking on philosophical and moral terms. And I don't think this is being thought through on philosophical and moral level in China so much, but we should be thinking about this because it could have massive implications for our society. So I think there is a willingness in the Chinese system to try and avoid this bipolar confrontation and to see how many people they can get on their side. There is not an interest in Europe to choose between either sides, but there is a very fundamental interest in Europe to see if we can bridge or prevent a gap from happening, or bridge a gap if it's there and bring partners closer together. But for that to happen, we also need higher awareness in the American system that climate change, the climate crisis is here, and that we need global action on that climate crisis. And I hope the American people will convince its leaders that this is not something you can just disregard and just brush aside, because that is going to lead to more confrontation on a global scale. And, it's going to affect the weakest and poorest in all our society if we don't tackle this. Rich people can buy themselves free of the consequences of climate crisis. At the end, no, everybody will suffer, but the ones who will suffer most are the weakest in our society. And then, talk about our way of life. If we let that happen, stop talking about our way of life. So I honestly believe that there are possibilities now with China. I know exactly what you're talking about, how the Chinese talk about us Europeans. At the same time, they see that our form of regulation sometimes does set the international standards. Chinese industry produces according to standards that were set in Europe and not the other way around. And I think this standard-setting power of Europe is something that we can sustain if we do it also to help avert the climate crisis. Now, I will need somebody else's hard drive to help me with the second question, because now I've lost... yes, on law and... yes. Nice, these German words that seem never to end. Lieferkettengesetz. We will have to look at, we've done some initiatives on corporate social responsibility, etc. We will have to increase that. And there's a lot of talk, and the French government is in favor of that, and it's also in my mandate, to create a tax at the European borders to stop carbon leakage from happening, the carbon border tax. Now, there are other ways of going about this as well, and I would like European consumers, when they put food on their table, to see on a label whether that food was produced at the expense of forests, yes or no. So that sort of understanding should be made very clear. We need a global action plan against deforestation, and we are not aware of the fact that much of the food we eat is a consequence of deforestation. And I want, through labeling and other legal ways, to make our consumers aware of that so they can make other choices. It is increasingly, we've done a lot of actions in the last couple of years, for instance, on cotton. We don't want our clothes to be made in a way that is completely unsustainable, both in social terms and environmental terms, and therefore we need to know where the cotton's coming from, and today we don't. So we need to put legislation in place to make sure we know that, and the responsibility should indeed be on the ones selling us these clothes. So it is not always true that the way Germans solve these things is going to work for the whole of Europe, but the thought behind it is something that will, if you want to make our economy circular, more sustainable, you will have to know where the primary products come from and whether they are being produced in a sustainable way, and you have to put that responsibility on someone. Just like smartphones, at some point we will have to regulate to make sure that those people who produce smartphones stay responsible for what happens with a smartphone in the life cycle. So that they stay responsible for the components of the smartphone afterwards, and that we can make sure these precious metals and other components are being reused again. And this you can only do through regulation. They will not do this on their own. Same with car batteries. I think somebody who makes a battery should be made responsible from day one for that battery until the end of its life cycle, including when you need to take it apart and reuse the components again. These are things that are very intrusive, but absolutely necessary if we don't want to deplete the Earth's natural resources. Yes, and the third question, are we too ambitious? Well, I've given you some ideas already of what we're going to do, but we will have to increase our requirements on emissions. We will have to make the ETS, the emissions trading system, which is starting to work pretty well, we have to expand that also to the maritime sector and to the airline sector. We have to make sure that we make this energy transition quicker than before, and it's, reality is that in Northern Europe, wind energy is already cheaper than traditional energy sources. Southern Europe, solar energy is already cheaper than traditional energy resources, so the market is helping us in that as well, but we have to invest massively in developing of technologies on hydrogen. Hydrogen, I think, on batteries, the Asians have gone way ahead, and I'm not sure we can, in the traditional lithium-ion batteries, we probably can't catch up, but we need to make batteries that are composed in a more sustainable way. But we also need to develop a hydrogen economy, because I believe it is possible to have steel works that operate with hydrogen. Just imagine that, what that would do for global emissions. And I also believe hydrogen can be an energy source for airlines, for ships, and also for cars through fuel cells. And hydrogen is an interesting, just imagine you could create in Africa huge solar parks and, change this electricity into hydrogen. Hydrogen can be transported over long distance without any energy loss, and then could be reconverted into electricity again. Just imagine the possibilities we have. And just imagine the interconnections we can create and create more stability on a global level. And we need to do that in the next couple of years. You say we're ambitious, you betcha, we are ambitious. But if we don't do that, I think, do you think my children and grandchildren will forgive us? I don't think so. I really don't think so. And we can only be ambitious, and this is, I'm not sort of, throwing the ball to you, but I've seen I developed a plastic strategy for the European Union, the banning of single-use plastics. When we started about this 3 years ago, people were ridiculing us. Oh, Europe, big about big things, and here comes this idiot with his plastic straws. But what happened, thanks to people like David Attenborough, thanks to a lot of media attention, thanks to the increasing awareness in our public that we are killing our oceans, this became legislation that we got through in record speed, and that is arguably the most popular legislation we came up with, the banning of single-use plastics in the last 5 years. So we had that on plastics. If we can get the same awakening of you guys, I'm talking about the general public, in terms of our climate crisis, we can move mountains in a couple of years' time. It takes public awareness and public willingness to push politicians in that direction, and then we can get this Green Deal done.
Time is... Time is running by, so I will take just, maybe if you agree, Vice President, just 2 questions. The lady there and the lady in front, because I'm looking for gender equality. So there we are.
Thank you. Well, thank you for taking my question, because I actually wanted to thank Frans here for his dedication to transparent government. Nobody has mentioned the film The European, which I thought was a tremendous contribution to our public's understanding of how policy is done and executed. So thank you again. Now going back to the New Deal, the Green New Deal, and going back to China and China's interest in Europe, we know that their interest and competition for resources, for water resources, land resources, has to do with purchasing of land. And whether it is the US President Trump who's interested in Greenland, or whether it is China that has considerable interest there, whether it is the purchases of French farms, any thoughts in the European Commission, in the European Parliament, on going back to the future and thinking about ownership of land among the European Union members? Thank you.
And then the last question for yourself. Could you stand up maybe so that they... Thank you.
The question was already a little bit answered. But I was just wondering if you could give us your view on what you believe are the 2 or 3 biggest challenges in actually achieving the ambitions.
On the land issue, I think in the European Union it is not the ownership of land that is the issue. I think the use of land is the big issue, and I think we need to rethink our common agricultural policy to make sure that we have better land use that produces the food we need without creating problems with nitrate and other toxic contributions to our natural environment. I think there is an opportunity. I'll give you one example. I'm going to try and launch a massive program of reforestation in Europe, and not just in rural areas, but wouldn't it be magical if we could green our cities, if we could sort of lower the temperature in cities with a couple of degrees because we have many trees there, if we could create much better and cleaner air in our cities. You know how many people die every year because of the air we breathe that is so dirty? I mean, this is one of the big secrets that is hidden from the public, how many people die. And this is something we can do something about. And wouldn't it be fun for every citizen to be part of an initiative that everyone plants trees? I think that would be a very exciting perspective. I think we just need to find the funds within our agricultural expenditure and other expenditure to make this happen, and then it can happen. And I think it would. These are some of these symbolic things that would have a transformational effect on people's understanding that they can contribute to a better environment. I shan't comment on Greenland, if you don't mind, but the future of Greenland is for people of Greenland to decide, and nobody else, I would argue. But sure, there is a race to get your hands on natural resources. The only solution to that is to not be dependent to this extent on natural resources, because you have a circular economy that you can reuse natural resources. That's the only sustainable solution to this. And then, of course, multilateralism, so that we have an agreement on that. I mean, we have part of the world's population that is aspiring to live like we do. But if everyone would live like we do on the present conditions, we need 3 planets and we only have 1. So, we need to change the way we live. This doesn't mean that we need to, go back to caves and eat grass. Not at all. We can even improve. I mean, just imagine, I even say that to the climate skeptics. Okay, just imagine that 95% of scientists are wrong and the 5% who deny are right. And still, we make our air clean. We are no longer dependent on fossil fuels. We create more social justice. Are these bad things or are these good things intrinsically? So even without the argument of climate change, these things are the things that will make our society stronger and better and more just. So let's take that argument to the people and to the politicians, and I think it's a winning argument, which brings me to the final question. You know, if you ask me what are the biggest challenges, I would say, and I saw this in my own country, I think you know my own country well, if I listen to you carefully. I saw this in my own country. People support the transition to a sustainable society. And people support the fight against climate change. And the Netherlands, what the Netherlands has done is translated this in concrete measures that need to be taken. Once you have these concrete measures taken, people say, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for this. And the only way we can get this done, and perhaps this is the biggest challenge for the Green Deal, is that people perceive what we're doing as just, also socially just, so that we leave no one behind, and that we show that those people who can afford to do a bit more, and those people who can't afford to do a bit more don't have to do a bit more. Everyone is willing to do their part. But if we let corporations off the hook, and we put all the burden on the shoulders of citizens, the citizens will not move along with this. But if we can demonstrate that what we're asking is linked to the capacity of people to deliver in a just and fair way, I think we can make this happen. But this Green Deal will only happen if it is done on the basis of social justice. This is the lesson I learned also in the electoral campaign, and I will not forget this. And social justice is not just fair pay for a fair job. Social justice is also filling the Just Transition Fund, which we are now creating, in such a way that you can go to Poland, to Slovakia, to Germany, to Spain, and say to the I'm a grandson of coal miners, so I have a very strong feeling for them, to say to the coal miners, sorry, we don't need your coal anymore. We're going to close the pit. But we have a plan for you to learn a new trade, which is needed in our economy, and we will finance that for you, so that you learn the new trade and you can retain your dignity as a worker with skills, no longer in the coal mines, but in another industry. If we don't do that, so the Just Transition Fund is fundamental, not just the legislation, but also fundamental to convince governments in Poland and in Slovakia and in Germany and in Spain to get rid of coal earlier than they want to do. If we don't create the right social conditions for workers to find another job or to be reskilled for another job, then they will stop this. So this, I think, is the biggest challenge we will be facing in the next 5 to 10 years. And thank you so very much for your attention and your patience. Thank you.